Welcome to Shattering Myths. I am Yahowah. Each weekday here on GCN, we strive to expose the destructive myths which are associated with religion and politics, with patriotism in the media, with military and economic schemes. Instead of merely presenting the news, our mission is to understand what is actually occurring behind these headlines, while predicting how these events will shape our world over the next 10 to 20 years. Then during our second hour, we're going to engage God on his terms through evidence and reason, since his is the lone credible voice in an exceedingly troubled world. Our phone number, if you'd like to participate in this discussion, is toll-free, 877-300-7645. It is my pleasure to introduce a guest this morning. He has written 2 books, one of which is currently available, Sharia, The Threats to America, and the second book, soon to be released, Raising a Jihadi Generation, which the byline is an MB handbook for law enforcement, military, and intelligence professionals. His name is John Guandolo, and I hope I pronounced that at least somewhat accurately, John. If I didn't, please correct me, but welcome to Shattering Myths, John.
Thank you. You did a great job.
Okay. John, you know, I went to your website. I've not read your book, but I know a thing or two about Islam. I've written 2 books on Islam. The most recent was called Prophet of Doom, which is the most comprehensive, probably the best documented, most contextual and chronological presentation of the 5 oldest Islamic sources that has ever been compiled. So I think I know a thing or two about Islam. And I personally met with al-Qaeda, so I know a little bit about the mindset. And so when I went to your site, everything I saw there jived with what I have come to know. And that's a good thing, because I very seldom run across somebody who speaks out on Islam who, at least from their web presence, isn't afraid to tell the whole truth as opposed to just a partial truth. So I want to compliment you on that. The thing that concerns me, of course, is that you have spent a considerable amount of your time in the military and in law enforcement, and from my perspective, most everything the military of the United States, law enforcement, the political actors in the United States have done has been not only counterproductive and dishonest, but suicidal relative to Islam. And so that gives me some pause in the midst of this. But when I received the presentation of your 2 books, it spoke of the things that took place in Europe last week, 2 weeks ago. One is that there have been riots in Sweden that have been devastating, and yet it's almost impossible in an American article to find any mention to Islam, and yet you correctly identify the riots taking place in Sweden as being Islamic. The murder of the soldier in Great Britain, Prime Minister of Great Britain specifically exonerated Islam from the murder. And then you mentioned the killing of the soldier in France immediately after the Muslim commenced prayers. At least that one was identified with Islam. Why is it, John, that the media, politicians, et al., are so opposed to actually telling people the truth, the motivation behind Islamic terrorism?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the introduction, and I do appreciate your support in what I'm doing. So thank you. I'm glad to be on the show today. If we just start, I think, for your listeners, with a real understanding that to break it down for them in this way, I think the political elite in the United States and in the West, but definitely in the United States, not just doesn't get this, because there are leaders who do get this and are not acting. And while
let me interrupt you. There's 1 second. So what you're saying, there are leaders in America who actually understand that Islam is the enemy, not a tactic terrorism. But those who do understand are moot. They're silent.
Most of them, yes. And I just, if you look at the dozen or so, for instance, just the members of Congress who do get this, who do speak out, they have all been hammered, and not just by the media, and not just by the Democrat Party and the Republicans. Those who speak out have been silenced by the leadership of the Republican Party, and the question would be why. And
by the way, what's interesting there is by the leadership of the Republican Party, because what you're inferring here, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do want to get your insights, because I am not an insider, and I'm not supportive of the American political establishment, and I have no political allegiance. I at one time had one. I've jettisoned it. But what you've inferred there is that there are no Democrats that know the truth, but there are some Republicans who know the truth. But the Republicans who know the truth, if they tell Americans the truth, that they are censured, that there is a significant consequence for doing so. Is that correct?
Yeah, by their own party. Yeah, by the leadership of the Republican Party.
So you're saying the Democrats are universally ignorant, the Republicans are mostly ignorant, but there's some who know, but those who know do not have the courage to tell the truth because the leadership of the Republican Party is expressly trying to hamper them if they do tell the truth.
Yes, but I want to clarify one thing on the with regards to the Democrat Party. There are, at least in my experience, at the state level, members of both parties who get this and want to defend their communities. At the national level, and I've kept a list for the last 6 years or so of members of Congress that we've briefed and I've briefed and continue to speak with. And we've done a number of programs on Capitol Hill, VIP briefs, caucuses, breakfasts, all kind of things to large group where both members of both parties have been invited. Never, not one time did a Democrat even show up to hear the message. And that, I got to tell you, is quite disheartening.
So the number one threat, at least the number one external threat, and I have to use external very loosely here, but let's just park that for a moment. Say the leading external threat to America is Islamic terrorism, and you're telling me that the national elected officials won't even go to a briefing on the causes, motivations, and means to thwart Islamic terrorism.
Correct. Certainly not ours. They did attend several briefings on Capitol Hill that were sponsored by the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas.
Oh, that's swell. That's swell.
That was, and usually, interestingly enough,
that would be like the U.S. military going to a briefing by Goebbels as to how they should interact with Nazi Germany.
Well, it's actually what it is. The Council on American Islamic Relations, which evidence demonstrates as a Hamas entity, and the Muslim Public Affairs Council, which is a Muslim Brotherhood entity, both regularly hold hearings and not hearings, but discussions on the Hill, panel discussions and otherwise. And I know that Democrats have attended those, but they have never attended the evidence and fact-based programs that we've done with committee chairs, hosted by committee chairs of various committees on the Hill. So that's one pretty big data point for your listeners. But I think backing out and looking at this thing strategically, whether I'm briefing somebody one-on-one or giving a course to military or law enforcement or other leaders, when I present the information, I do it as if I'm going into a courtroom, because the information is solid and it's evidentiary.
Correct.
This is information that the government has.
Of course.
It's information that exists. That is, much of it's already been presented in some of the largest terrorism trials in U.S. history. And yet, when you line it out and say, well, the evidence. For instance, these 200 documents where this organization, for instance, the Islamic Society of North America, demonstrates they're the largest Muslim Brotherhood entity here in the U.S. They're financially supporting Hamas. Here are the actual documents where they're sending money directly to Hamas overseas. and their current president sits on the Homeland Security Advisory Committee, advises the National Security Council, has an award from the FBI, and gives panel discussions at CIA headquarters. And at some point, somebody has to be held accountable for this, because it's criminal. And actually, there are, Congress, passed a motion that says the FBI cannot work with unindicted co-conspirators in terrorism-related cases, and yet the FBI continues to do so. And who's being held accountable?
So, John, let me ask you another question. You've mentioned CAIR and Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. Does the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and CAIR have an independent agenda that is in any way differentiated from Islam?
No.
No. So are collectively Hamas, CAIR, and the Muslim Brotherhood then the cause of Islamic terrorism, or is the cause Islam?
So first, let me clarify one point. CAIR, Council on American Islamic Relations, is Hamas. Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. So the parent organization of Hamas, al-Qaeda, is the Muslim Brotherhood.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about the same there. But when you talk about al-Qaeda and other violent jihadi groups, or you talk about nation states that are part of, for instance, the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is the entire...
Name them all. Put them all into a hat, including Hezbollah et al., which Hezbollah is not an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, but all the others are. If you put them all into a hat, is there any difference between the Islamic terrorist organizations and Islam? Do they have an agenda that is separate from Islam, or is their agenda Islam?
No, the al-Qaeda, the Brotherhood, the Shia organizations like Hezbollah and others, but specifically when we're talking about al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the vast majority of the Islamic world, which is Sunni, but that also obviously includes, as you noted, Iran and Hezbollah being an arm of the Iranian government. Their objectives are the objectives of Islam, and this is one thing that I think...
So we're going to have to stop for a moment because we're going to break, John. But we'll be back after the break. So stay with us. But the issue is, if there's no differentiation between Islam and these organizations, then the problem is Islam. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I'm your host, Yahowah. We're having a conversation with John Grandolo. John is the author of Sharia, The Threat to America. He has a new book that will soon be released called Raising a Jihadi Generation. John is unique in that he is the first insider I think I have spoken to that actually understands that the problem is Islam as opposed to causing people to think that the enemy is a symptom of Islam. So this is a very unique conversation that we're having with John. John, I have another question for you. Your site seems to, and your first book focuses on Sharia law. So for our listeners, what is the basis of Sharia law?
Okay, thanks for that lead-in, because it answers the question we went to the break with. Sharia is the governing law that all Muslims are required to follow and adhere to.
Yeah, what is the source of it?
So Sharia comes from the Quran, which is the uncreated word of God that was given to Muhammad through a series of revelations over 23 years.
John, 1% of Sharia comes from the Quran. Where does 99% of Sharia come from?
Well, actually, it's not just 1%, but the Sharia comes from the Quran and the teachings and the life of the Prophet Muhammad.
Sunnah is the answer to the question. About 1% of Sharia law is actually Quran based, because the Quran, as you deal with the first, all of the surahs revealed in Medina, there isn't anything that you can make a law out of. It's just an ongoing rant. and the chapters that were allegedly given to Muhammad in Medina are so jumbled and they're so out of context that there is no way to make a set of laws out of them either. So they.
Well, actually, I just want to get one point that's very important. In 3 places in the Quran, it specifically says that what chronologically comes last abrogates.
Correct.
Or overrules legally what comes before it.
Right. And so how can you reorder the Quran chronologically since it's a jumbled mess? What tool do you need?
Well, the scholars have done that.
How have they done that?
Have arranged the Quran in chronological order.
How have they done that?
Well,
how have they done that, John?
Well, they've done that because they know when the different.
Okay. No, let me help you out with this, John. Sure. Let me help you out with this. I know this inside and out. Sharia law is based on Sunnah. Sunnah is the example and the words of Muhammad. The concept means custom, but if you look at any Islamic definition, it's the words and deeds of Muhammad. The words and deeds of Muhammad are not chronicled in the Quran. They're chronicled in the Hadith, and the Hadith collectively comprise Sunnah. So the Hadith, which is the words and deeds, the example of Muhammad, are chronicled in the Hadith. There are four sources of Hadith that were written within 200 years of Muhammad's death. 2 are topical arrangements, one by Muslim, one by Bukhari, and 2 are chronological arrangements, one by Ishaq, which is the biography of Muhammad, the other one is the history of Islam by Tabari. Collectively, those 4 sources are the tools that are used to put the Quran in chronological order. There's no way to put the Quran in chronological order without, in particular, the Hadith collections by Ishaq and the biography or Sirah, or the Tariq, the history of Islam's formation by Tabari. Those are the tools that put the Quran in chronological order, and the basis of Sunnah is almost exclusively those Hadith collections that describe Muhammad's words and deeds.
That's correct, but the Quran is the basis for that because that's the uncreated Word of God.
Well, that's actually not true either. The Quran is nothing but Muhammad's situational scriptures.
I'm talking about this from the Islamic doctrinal point of view.
Yes, it's correct. Muslims believe that the Quran is the perfect word of God. Anyone who actually reads the Quran set into the context of Muhammad's life and in chronological order, as is made possible by the Hadith, realizes that the Quran is nothing more than Muhammad's personal rantings to serve his own personal lust for sex, power, and money. And so,
and I'm right, and I understand, and I'm not disputing what you're saying. What I'm saying is, as a national security consultant, when I do this analysis and present it to 4-star generals or members of Congress, I give it to them because our warfighting doctrine says we take the enemy's doctrine as it stands. And had we done that at 9/11, we'd be in a very different place. 100% of us have.
Yeah, in fact, if 9/11, we're going to have to go to break again, John. We'll have a longer segment following it. If immediately after 9/11 the President of the United States exposed and condemned Islam based upon its source documents, the world would be a very different place today. We'll return with Shattering Myths after the commercial break. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're having a conversation with John Guandolo. He is the author of Sharia, The Threat to America. And we're talking about the basis of Sharia law and how much of that comes from Sunnah, which is presented in the Hadith, which is the words and deeds of Muhammad, versus from the Quran itself. John, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the Quran constantly tells Muslims that they have to follow Muhammad's orders. It's always presented as you have to follow Allah's and Muhammad's orders, or it's actually usually not Muhammad, but Allah and his messengers' orders. Since the Quran is allegedly, you and I know that it isn't, but from God, and that there is no God named Allah. That being the case, but Muslims believe that this horrible book is actually from the creator of the universe. Does the Quran, since it's supposed to be the Word of God, present Muhammad's orders?
The Quran Quran, according to Islam, yes, is the uncreated Word of God.
So the question's pretty simple. Does the Quran present Allah's orders or Muhammad's orders?
Well, according to Islam, it presents Allah's orders.
Correct. So since the Quran tells Muslims they must follow Allah's orders and the Messenger's orders, where would a Muslim go to find the Messenger's orders?
The Hadith.
That is correct. Now, when you turn to the Hadith, does it not present Muhammad as a terrorist?
Well, according to them, it presents him as a warrior. And again,
actually, the Quran and the Hadith use the term terror. Muhammad actually said in the Hadith, "I have become victorious through terror."
Yes, and strike terror into the hearts of your enemy.
Correct. And so Allah claims to be a terrorist. Muhammad claims to be a terrorist in the Hadith. He actually led 75 terrorist raids according to the Hadith. So it would be pretty clear that if you were a Muslim and you wanted to take seriously Allah's orders to follow Muhammad's example, which the Quran also orders Muslims to do, and to follow his orders, and you read the Hadith, would it be impossible to follow his orders and examples and not be a terrorist?
Yeah, well let me just clarify. When the short answer is that they're not misinterpreting anything.
That's correct.
But there are one of the things that I think people that do not understand what you were speaking about is that jihad is just one thing. Jihad is only defined in Islamic law, all published Islamic law, as warfare against non-Muslims.
Correct.
But
Actually, wait. There's a little. I really love precision, and you're a guy that knows this material. So while jihad is defined as warfare, it's always defined as warfare against non-Muslims. It is also against peaceful Muslims. Allah specifically in the 9th surah tells Muslims that they need to perpetrate jihad against peaceful Muslims because peaceful Muslims are hypocrites, and that Allah wants the good jihadi Muslims to kill the peaceful Muslims so that he can attend to their tortures in the hottest places in hell. So it's not, jihad is, well, you are correct, it is 100% warfare. It is not just against non-Muslims, but also against peace-loving Muslims.
Right, and jihad specifically is total war. And
right.
So while you might have somebody who's 80 years old and who cannot fight in a jihad, they can still participate in a jihad. And at the bare minimum, they must hate un-Islamic governments and non-Muslims in parts.
Right.
But they can do all kinds of things. They can provide money. They can provide their home or food to jihadis. They can do all kinds of things. And there are rules under Islamic law when there is a caliph or a leader, when there's been a declared caliphate, which we had for most of history up until the 1920s when the Ottoman Empire was dissolved. The rules for jihad are a little different. So you can have a regional jihad. You can have, when there's no caliph, representatives from the Islamic community, i.e. al-Qaeda, can wage jihad on behalf of the Muslims in those circumstances. And, for instance, when non-Muslim forces enter Muslim lands, then all Muslims must wage jihad in whatever way they can. Non-Muslims can, or Muslims can no longer leave that duty to a specific group within the Muslim community. So when we were in Saudi Arabia or Iraq, Afghanistan, and we're waging war against Muslims, it becomes obligatory. So when we hear leaders from al-Qaeda or the global Muslim Brotherhood community like Yusuf al-Qaradawi say publicly, it is the duty of all Muslims to wage jihad and kill American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right. You used the term, John, that you said obligatory. The Quran and Hadith both present these orders as Muslims have no choice. That once if a Islamic general, an Islamic leader makes a decision, that Muslims have no choice, they must obey. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, there is no free will in Islam. So the whole concept of imposing democracy on an Islamic country requires you to be either ignorant or irrational. Is that valid?
I would not disagree with that, and I would also say that as your listeners may recognize, we fought 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and what ended up happening is we, the United States government, wrote the constitutions that created Islamic republics governed by Sharia Islamic law.
Right. Both invasions, and at the time, I knew George W. Bush personally, and at the time of both invasions, I predicted exactly what would transpire, and that both invasions would be not only counterproductive but actually suicidal. Let's talk about just Iraq for a moment. The President of the United States said justified the invasion of Iraq on 2 things. One was yellow cake uranium that was going to become the smoking gun, and also about the harboring al-Qaeda in Iraq as justifications for going in. Were either of those 2 justifications valid?
I think the idea of weapons of mass destruction was valid. We found them. We found biological weapons, and
did he import the yellow cake uranium that the President of the United States disclosed in the State of the Union address?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. In fact, he knew it at the time to be a lie. And wasn't Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein mortal enemies, sworn enemies, at the time that we invaded Iraq?
They were.
Yeah. So the justification for invading Iraq was a lie. And then as it relates to the consequence of invading Iraq, did we not depose a secular dictator and give Iraq to Iran?
Yes, we did.
Yes, and so
are
Iran's
Iran's
nuclear ambitions, therefore, were they benefited by us invading Iraq and giving Iraq to Iran?
Yes. And
was that suicidal?
It's one of the key reasons that Saudi Arabia strongly supported Americans staying in Iraq, because they knew that was the buffer between them and Iran, and they know that, or at least they believe, that there is a war coming between Sunni and Shia, and Yusuf al-Qaradawi.
It already is. It already is. I mean, the Syrian war is a direct result of America invading Iraq and giving Iraq to Iran. The Syrian war would not be taking place today if America hadn't invaded Iraq and given Iraq to Iran.
Agreed. I also want to say that I want to go back to your comments about why we invaded Iraq. I believe that across the board, our complete lack at the strategic level of understanding the enemy has caused us to make these catastrophic decisions.
Yeah. Catastrophic is a good term, John. That's really a good term. And what you're saying is complete ignorance has caused us to make catastrophic decisions on a national level.
Yes. And the fact that we do not understand at the national level in this government, in the military or national leadership structure, the national security structure, you ask who is the enemy, and you will get all kinds of answers. Usually you'll get al-Qaeda.
Right.
And the fact that our government cannot articulate who the enemy is and what it is they're fighting for, even though every day they say we are jihadis fighting jihad in furtherance of Islamic law to impose Islamic law, and we've decided we're not going to look at Islamic law, it is absolute catastrophic failure. And that's why we ended up, the U.S. government put our full weight behind al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. We're now doing it in Syria. That's the U.S. government.
Correct. On the wrong side. On the wrong side. On the wrong side.
And we're going to keep doing it because we do not know what we're doing.
You know, you have to wonder after a while, John, if it is because we are ignorant at a national level, or is it deliberate? There is just, when you get malfeasance of this magnitude, you engage in 2 wars that cost America $6 trillion, that are both suicidal, that both were obviously going to make bad situations much worse. And it was anyone who understood Islam knew that our invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq were going to make bad situations much worse, and that we were going after symptoms and we were fighting a war against a tactic. And that we squandered $6 trillion and probably 1 million lives. That doing something that was suicidal, you have to wonder, can it just be a result of being stupid? Or is there something more to it?
Well, I think there's something more to it. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there are leaders in the government who do understand this. There is as you know from being familiar with my work, the men, the Muslims who are at the senior levels of our government advising State Department, CIA, the White House, National Security Staff, the Pentagon, we can identify them by name as being Muslim brothers. So, of course, it's no wonder that we would call the Muslim Brotherhood Revolution in the Middle East an Arab Spring, that we would back al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood against Muammar Gaddafi, that we would write constitutions that create Islamic republics in Afghanistan and Iraq.
So it's a lot more than stupid.
It's a lot more than stupid.
Yeah, boy, that is extraordinarily insightful. I've recognized that for a long time, but it's nice to hear an insider speak those words. Let's talk a little bit, John, and I'd love to have you back on a future program because I'd like to spend some time on debunking the myth of al-Qaeda. Having served in the FBI, are you aware of who conceived the plan that became known as 9/11, who it was, where they were, when it was conceived, and when the United States, particularly the FBI, became aware of it?
I am. Would you like, after the break, would you like to?
I would love for you to share with our listeners who actually conceived the plot that is known as 9/11, when they conceived it, where they were at the time, and when the United States became aware of that plot, and how far before 9/11 those revelations became known to us. I am Yada. This is Shattering Myths. We're with John Guandolo. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're having a conversation with John Guandolo, who is a unique individual in that he has not only written 2 books regarding Islam, but he is doing so from an insider's perspective, as someone who has access to the political establishment and the law enforcement establishment in America. His 2 books, the one that you can currently buy is called Sharia, The Threat to America, and the second is Raising a Jihadi Generation. And what you have made unmistakably clear, John, is that our invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the consequence, which is now the war in Syria and the Islamic Reformation that is taking place throughout the Islamic world, isn't just an accident of the United States. But and so it's not just a product of stupidity, but that it is actually was orchestrated by the United States, which means that there are fundamentalist Muslims that are influencing the decisions that America is making that are actually suicidal for America. Is that correct? Have I summarized your position accurately?
I've got to say, I think you did, and I want to just mention one thing specifically about Afghanistan and to Iraq to some degree. I think the military there, the operations were superb, and we have whittled down the numbers of jihadi fighters, and that is a benefit. But like any war where you fight, if you go in without a strategic understanding of what you're doing, then as you've mentioned, you can't be successful because you're fighting a war that while the effects of what you're doing might have the outcome of, reducing numbers, strategically, we didn't understand the impact. Yeah. Because we don't know what their strategy is, because we're telling our military guys and our law enforcement intelligence communities, you can't look at that. You can't learn it. We can't teach it to you because it has nothing to do with Islam.
Yeah. Now, John, I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to give you a pass here because I know you have been a Marine and served as a Marine. I'm going to give you a pass because of I understand your perspective. But what you've said is inaccurate. We actually manufactured far more Islamic terrorists than we killed. We manufacture 100 Islamic terrorists for every one we kill with our drones, and we did the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. We manufacture our own enemy. What we did in Iraq and Afghanistan was counterproductive. That doesn't mean that the boots on the ground didn't perform well, but the strategy was so flawed that we actually made a bad situation worse in both countries.
Well, but what I'm trying to say is this enemy only understands strength. And if we had actually hit them where they hurt and you crush them...
No, you can't. So what do? You're going to kill every Muslim? You can't do that.
No, that's not what I'm saying. But you got to put your power at their power base and crush them and let them know that to continue, because they fight according to Islamic law. And the only reason they'll stop the jihad is if they realize that they're in a position not to win the jihad. And
well, they will never come to that position. Religion is irrational. All religions are rational. Those who are religious do not respond to evidence and reason. And so
this isn't religion. This is a totalitarian doctrine, as you've articulated.
Islam is a religion. It is, yes, it is a totalitarian doctrine. It is. It's like all religions that are equal parts politics and religion. It is a religion based upon world conquest, and it's a religion based upon killing, where the most noble act in the religion is jihad. Religious individuals are not rational, and so it's my contention, John, that what you are doing is actually the most effective weapon that can be wielded at Islam, and that by using bullets and bombs, we are manufacturing more enemy than we kill, very much like what happened in Vietnam. But what you are actually doing, which is to write books explaining that the problem is Islam, fundamentalist Islam, that the terrorists have not corrupted their religion has corrupted them, that by writing books on this, being willing to speak out on this, being willing to brief national leaders and the media on this, that wielding the truth, using as you mentioned, as a lawyer presenting evidence as if you were in a court of law, is the single most effective weapon that can be wielded against Islam. You're actually doing it now.
I appreciate that comment.
And so what you find with any zealot, and it doesn't matter if it's a political zealot or a religious zealot, it doesn't matter if you were dealing with the communists in Vietnam or the religious jihadists in Iraq and Afghanistan, when you fight them by dropping bombs on them, you actually empower them. You manufacture more of them than you kill. But when you undermine their credibility, so it makes it difficult for them to recruit and retain new adherents by demonstrating how egregious they are, it's a different story.